Imagine for a moment that it's the year 1655. You're living in the city of Oxford, England, and the bubonic plague has just arrived at your doorstep.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's bleak. The streets are largely empty, save for the carts carrying away the dead. The entire nation is already fractured, bleeding from a brutal, protracted civil war that, literally saw the king of the country beheaded.
Right, just total chaos.
Total chaos. And in the middle of all of this, you are tasked with running the most prestigious university in the country. You're navigating intense political crosshairs. You are actively burying your own children. And yet, by candlelight, in the dead of night, you're sitting down to write theological masterpieces that will literally alter the course of history.
It shatters every preconceived notion we have about how great intellectual work is produced, doesn't it?
Completely.
I mean, we have the deeply ingrained, romanticized image of the scholar. We picture, like, a quiet, sunlit, mahogany-paneled library.
The classic ivory tower.
Exactly, the ivory tower. We picture someone insulated from the grit and the grime and, well, the tragedy of the outside world, just given the absolute luxury of undisturbed peace to think deep thoughts.
Right. We assume clarity requires isolation. But when you step into the world of 17th-century theology, and specifically into the lives of the Puritans, that ivory tower is practically on fire.
Yeah, it's burning to the ground.
So welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, our deep dive is looking through the lens of a brilliant 1994 biographical message by John Piper. And we're focusing on a man who's been dead for over 3 centuries, yet remains an absolute colossus in the landscape of theology.
An absolute giant.
We are talking about John Owen. And the goal for you listening to this right now is to really extract the life lessons of this 17th century Puritan, because this is a guy who managed to produce world-changing, massive theological works while navigating immense, unthinkable personal tragedy.
And intense political pressure, too.
Exactly, shifting national regimes that eventually made him a fugitive from the law.
The sheer contrast between his output and his external circumstances is, it's what makes him so endlessly fascinating. We're talking about someone who is widely considered by historians and theologians alike to be the tallest redwood in the forest of theology.
The tallest redwood. I love that description.
It's perfect, right?
Yeah.
He's a giant among giants. Yet his day-to-day existence was a crucible. It was filled with plague, the devastating loss of almost all his children, and the violent upheaval of civil war.
He wasn't writing from a place of tranquil theory at all?
No, not even a little bit. He was writing from the absolute trenches of human suffering.
Well, I want to start by unpacking this legacy a bit, because it's seriously intimidating. If you aren't familiar with him, John Owen died in 1683, so we were reaching way back.
Yeah.
But his influence on contemporary figures is just staggering.
Oh, absolutely.
Take J.I. Packer, for example. Packer is one of the most influential theologians of the 20th century, and he literally claimed that reading John Owen saved him from going there.
Saved his sanity.
Yeah. Or falling into what he called mystical fanaticism during his student days. How exactly does a 300-year-old theology book save a modern student's sanity?
It's a profound story, and it really gets to the mechanics of what makes Owen's writing so powerful.
Yeah.
To understand the weight of Packer's claim, you first have to realize that for Packer, the Puritans as a whole were those redwoods of theology.
Right.
They were the benchmark for deep, experiential Christianity. And he calls Owen the absolute tallest of those redwoods. He said that for solidity, profundity, and majesty in explaining God's ways with humanity, no one touches Owen.
But what was happening to Packer specifically that he needed saving?
Well, Packer was a young convert, studying at Oxford, ironically enough.
Oh, the irony.
Right. And he was struggling under the weight of perfectionistic teaching.
Let's define that for the listener. What does perfectionistic teaching actually look like in practice?
Essentially, it's a brand of theology that doesn't take the ongoing daily reality of indwelling sin seriously enough. It suggests that once you're a Christian, you should be able to reach a state where you are victorious over sin in a virtually complete way.
Like you hit a higher spiritual plane or something.
Exactly. You level up. But the problem is, when a sensitive, honest conscience like Packer's looks internally and sees that they still struggle with pride, with lust, with envy, they don't conclude that the theology is wrong.
They conclude that they must be fake Christians.
Precisely. Or they push themselves into a kind of psychological break, trying to manufacture a purity they just can't sustain.
So it's basically a recipe for absolute despair. You're trying to climb a ladder that has no top, and you keep slipping.
It was driving him to despair, is creating this mystical fanaticism where
Right.
he was desperately seeking some emotional, spiritual high just to prove he was saved. And then he discovered John Owen. Specifically, he found Owen's writings on indwelling sin and the mortification of sin. And Owen offered this incredibly grounded, realistic, yet deeply hopeful theology.
What did Owen say that clicked so well?
Owen essentially said, yes, sin remains in the believer. It is a lifelong battle, but grace is greater, and here's how you practically, daily fight that battle without losing your assurance. It brought Packer back to reality and, practically speaking, saved his sanity.
That makes so much sense. It's like a doctor finally giving you an accurate diagnosis. Instead of saying you shouldn't be coughing, the doctor says you have a chronic condition, but here is the medicine you take every single day to live a vibrant life.
That is a perfect analogy.
Mm.
And, it wasn't just Packer who felt this way. Roger Nicole, who was a brilliant theologian and taught at Gordon Conwell Seminary for over 40 years, made a staggering claim.
What did he say?
He stated that John Owen is the greatest theologian who has ever written in the English language.
The greatest in the English language.
Yeah.
That covers a lot of ground.
It does. In fact, Nicole even paused and specifically clarified that he meant Owen was greater than Jonathan Edwards.
And Jonathan Edwards is widely considered America's greatest intellectual export.
Right. Interestingly enough, Edwards himself highly recommended Owen's writings to others.
You also have Sinclair Ferguson, another heavy hitter in modern theology. He noted that when he was reading contemporary evangelical literature as a teenager, it just wasn't touching the deep issues of his heart. It felt shallow.
Yeah.
But when he picked up Owen, he found these penetrating expositions that provided him with profound assurances of grace. So you have all these heavyweights pointing back to this one man from the 1600s. But here's the catch. Here's where it gets really interesting and honestly a little bit funny. Because John Owen is notoriously difficult to read.
He is definitely not beach reading.
No, not at all. His writing style is dense, it's complex, and it demands absolute focus. I mean, his sentences can run for an entire paragraph.
Oh, easily.
Let's look at his most famous book, which he published in 1647 when he was just 31 years old. It has this very intense title, The Death of Death in the Death of Christ.
Try saying that 5 times fast.
Right. But it's considered the ultimate, most persuasive defense of limited atonement. For those who might not know the jargon, that's the L in the tulipy acronym of Calvinism.
Right. And limited atonement is admittedly a terrible marketing term.
It really is.
It sounds inherently negative, as if God is stingy with his grace. A better term, and the one Owen effectively argues for, is particular redemption or definite atonement.
Let's break that down mechanically. What exactly is Owen arguing in this incredibly dense book?
So the entire premise of the book rests on verses like Ephesians 5.25, where the Apostle Paul says that Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her.
Okay.
Owen is arguing that on the cross, Christ did something decisive, particular, and sovereign, specifically for his bride, the church. This is fundamentally different from just a general, vague love for humanity as a whole.
So he's pushing against the idea that Jesus just died to make salvation possible for anyone who happens to choose it.
Precisely. Owen argues for a covenant love. Let's use a human analogy.
Sure.
A good husband might have a general goodwill and love for his neighbors, his coworkers, and his community. He desires their best. But the love he has for his wife is exclusive, particular, and covenantal.
He would sacrifice himself for her in a way he wouldn't for a total stranger.
Exactly. Owen is saying that Christ's love for his elect is like that husband's love, but infinitely greater. It's a love that actually pursues, overtakes, subdues, forgives, and transforms the beloved.
It overcomes all human resistance.
Yes. Christ didn't just die to create a potential salvation. His death actively purchased and accomplished actual salvation for a specific people.
I see. If salvation is just a potential, then theoretically, Jesus could have died and no one could have been saved if no one chose him.
Right, which means the cross could have been a failure.
But Owen is arguing that the cross was an actual guaranteed transaction.
Yes. And he details this argument with surgical precision over hundreds of pages. He dismantles the opposing arguments piece by piece, looking at the original Greek, the historical context, and the logical flow of the entire biblical narrative.
But the way he writes about it, he knew exactly how difficult his work was. He wasn't under any illusions. Think about how a modern author operates today. They want a catchy hook in the introduction. They want easy, bite-sized takeaways. They want bullet points.
Owen had zero commercial instinct.
Zero. If you look at the to the reader preface in The Death of Death, it is frankly brutal.
It's the complete antithesis of a modern marketing strategy.
He essentially tells casual readers, he coins the term title gazers, that if they're just there to skim the book and leave, they've had their entertainment by looking at the cover, and they can kindly say farewell.
Yeah, just put the book down.
He says if you're not going to roll up your sleeves and think, don't even open the first chapter.
He's demanding a level of rigor and engagement that most readers, especially today, simply aren't prepared to give. But that uncompromising nature is exactly why his work endures centuries later.
Because he refused to dumb it down.
Right. He isn't writing for mass appeal. He's writing for absolute, airtight theological precision. He knew that the truths he was dealing with, the very nature of God's saving grace, were too important to be watered down. And the reward for wrestling with Owen, as J.I. Packer noted, is worth all the heavy labor involved.
It's like a chef putting a warning label on their restaurant door. If you want fast food, go across the street. This meal's going to take 4 hours to eat, and it will change your life.
That's a great way to put it.
So the overarching question of this deep dive is this. How does a guy with zero marketing instinct and this incredibly dense, laborious prose end up being called the Calvin of England and the Atlas and Patriarch of Independency?
Right.
To understand how he wrote with such immense gravity, we have to look at how his life was forged. Because his life was an absolute crucible.
To understand that crucible, we have to start with his early life, which is really a study in extreme contrasts. John Owen was born in 1616. And to anchor that in the timeline of history for you, that is the exact same year William Shakespeare died.
Wow. Okay, so we're at the end of the Elizabethan era, moving into a vastly different world.
Exactly. This places Owen squarely in the middle of what historians often call the Great Puritan Century, which ran roughly from 1560 to 1660.
Can we pause there for a second? Because the word Puritan carries a lot of baggage today.
Oh, definitely.
People hear that word and they immediately picture people with buckles on their hats who hate fun, hate joy, and are obsessed with making sure no one is having a good time anywhere. What were the Puritans actually about in this historical context?
That's a massive historical caricature. The Puritans were actually a vibrant, deeply passionate movement. Their primary goal was to complete the English Reformation.
Because they felt it was unfinished.
Right. They felt that the Church of England had separated from the Pope in Rome, but had kept far too many of the unbiblical rituals and bureaucratic structures.
Yeah.
The Puritans were pushing for deeper pastoral renewal. They wanted preaching to be central to worship rather than ritual. They wanted effective and loving church discipline, and they wanted a vigorous, personal, evangelical faith.
They were deeply concerned with the heart, not just outward conformity.
Exactly.
So his father was a nonconformist pastor, meaning he leaned heavily into this Puritan mindset. But John Owen himself was a phenomenon. He was an absolute prodigy. He goes to Oxford University at the age of 12 years old.
Yeah, 12. And he gets his Bachelor of Arts at 16 and his Master of Arts at 19.
That's just wild.
And he was so driven, so consumed with this ferocious zeal for knowledge, that he supposedly only slept 4 hours a night during his teenage years. He was trying to consume every piece of classical literature, philosophy, theology, and language he could get his hands on.
Which, as we learn later, completely ruined his physical health for the rest of his life.
It really did.
He deeply regretted it when he was older and confined to sickbeds. He basically borrowed physical energy from his future to fund his teenage academic obsession.
It's a classic case of youthful zeal outpacing biological limits. But what's really critical in this early stage is his departure from Oxford. Despite being on the fast track for his Bachelor of Divinity, he couldn't stomach the theological climate that was taking over the university.
What was happening at Oxford?
Well, Oxford was becoming heavily steeped in what is known as High Church Arminianism, pushed by the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud.
Okay, let's unpack High Church Arminianism. What does that mean mechanically for a student at Oxford in the 1630s?
High Church refers to an emphasis on ritual, liturgy, priestly authority, and outward ceremony. It was a move back toward the aesthetics and structures of Catholicism.
And the Arminianism side?
On the theological side, Arminianism is a system that emphasizes human free will in salvation over and above God's absolute sovereignty. It essentially teaches that God's election is based on him foreseeing who would choose him, and that Christ's death made salvation possible for all, but guaranteed for none unless they exercise their free will.
Which directly contradicts the Reformed Calvinistic view that Owen was starting to solidify in his own mind, the view that God is the sovereign author and finisher of faith from beginning to end.
Precisely. Owen couldn't compromise his deep theological convictions. The environment was becoming increasingly hostile to anyone who held Puritan or Reformed views. They were demanding strict conformity to these new, rigid high church rituals.
So what does he do?
He makes a massive career sacrifice. He dropped out. He left Oxford and became a personal tutor and chaplain for wealthy families near London just to make ends meet.
And this sets the stage for the major turning point of his entire life. The year is 1642. Owen is 26 years old. He has this massive encyclopedic head knowledge. He's a convinced Calvinist. He understands the doctrines of grace backward and forward.
Yes.
But there is a crucial distinction made here. He entirely lacked the sense of the reality of his own salvation. He had the theology in his brain, but no personal assurance in his soul. How does a prodigy who knows everything about God struggle to know if he's actually saved?
Because intellectual apprehension of facts is fundamentally different from the spiritual apprehension of grace. You can dissect the theological concept the way a biologist dissects a frog. You can know all the parts. But that doesn't mean you feel the warmth of God's love.
That's a great distinction.
Owen was trapped in his own head. He knew that God was sovereign, and he knew that humanity was sinful, and he was likely terrified that despite all his knowledge, he was not one of God's elect. He was carrying an immense psychological burden.
So, seeking relief from this heavy burden, he goes to London with a cousin to hear a very famous Presbyterian preacher named Edmund Calamy. He's hoping this towering intellectual preacher will say something to unlock his heart.
But Calamy couldn't preach that day. He wasn't there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, instead, a substitute took the pulpit. Just a simple, unknown, uncredentialed country preacher. We don't even know his name to this day.
That's incredible.
When Owen's cousin saw that the famous guy wasn't speaking, he actually wanted to leave and go find another church. But something, perhaps exhaustion or just providence, kept Owen in his seat.
And this unnamed, simple preacher steps up and takes his text from Matthew 8:26. Why are you fearful, O you of little faith?
And that was it. That was the moment everything changed for the greatest theologian in the English language. It wasn't a complex lecture on predestination. It was a simple question about fear and faith.
The moment is described as God's appointed word at the appointed time. All of Owen's doubts, all his agonizing fears about whether he was truly born anew by the Holy Spirit, they just vanished. The theology traveled from his head to his heart.
He felt liberated. He felt adopted as a son of God.
This raises such an important question about how God works through the most unexpected, unassuming mechanisms. This brilliant Oxford prodigy who had read all the classics, who understood the deepest, most complex nuances of theology, is finally given peace of soul, not by a towering academic intellect, but by a substitute country preacher asking a basic, penetrating question.
It's incredibly humbling. And it immediately made me think of the direct parallel to Charles Spurgeon's conversion, which happened about 2 centuries later.
Oh, it's almost an identical scenario.
Exactly.
Right. In 1850, Spurgeon is a young man, also struggling under immense conviction of sin, desperately trying to figure out how to be saved. He's driven by a massive snowstorm into this tiny, primitive Methodist chapel. The ordained pastor is stuck in the snow and can't make it. So a layman, a shoemaker or a tailor, someone completely uneducated, stands up, looks right at young Spurgeon, and preaches from Isaiah 45:22. Look to me and be saved, all the ends of the earth. And the man literally just tells Spurgeon to look to Jesus. And in that moment, Spurgeon is converted.
It's such a profound irony.
You have these brilliant generation-defining theologians, Owen and Spurgeon, and they're unlocked by the simplest, uneducated preachers.
It perfectly illustrates a core tenet of Reformed theology, that salvation is entirely a work of the Holy Spirit, not human intellect or persuasion. It proves that intellectual knowledge of theology is not the same as the experiential assurance of grace.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
For Owen, that moment of assurance changed everything. It breathed fire into his massive intellect. Every profound thing he later wrote on the work of the Spirit, on communion with God, on the glory of Christ, it all stems directly from the living reality of what happened in that pew in 1642.
But right alongside that immense spiritual breakthrough comes the most heartbreaking, sobering reality of his entire life. In 1644, he marries a young woman named Mary Rooke. They were married for 31 years. And there is an absolutely stunning, devastating detail about their life together.
It's just hard to even comprehend.
They had 11 children, and 10 of them died in early childhood. The one surviving daughter grew up, entered into a very unhappy marriage, eventually returned home to her parents, and died of consumption as a young adult.
He buried his wife, and he buried every single one of his 11 children. Let that sink in. He lost a child on average every 3 years of his adult life.
I cannot fathom the psychological and spiritual toll that takes on a human being. We talked earlier about how he was writing in a crucible. This is it.
Hmm.
How do you process that level of relentless grief?
If we connect this grief to the bigger picture of his theological writing, it changes how you read him entirely. When you pick up John Owen and he is writing about walking intimately with God, or about the mortification of sin, or about keeping your mind set on heaven, he's not writing from an abstract, theoretical, sunny standpoint.
No.
He is writing from the absolute depths of the valley of the shadow of death. He's a man who knows what it means to look into an open grave year after year.
And yet, there's no bitterness recorded in his works. You don't read his books and feel like you're reading a cynic. The historical analysis notes that he almost never explicitly mentions Mary or the children or his specific personal pain in his published books.
He keeps it very focused on God.
But the depth of his dealing with God, the sheer gravity and weight of his words, it's all completely soaked in that grief. It's like the difference between someone explaining the concept of a storm based on a textbook and a sailor explaining a storm while standing on the deck of a sinking ship.
Precisely. His theology had to be robust enough to survive the death of 11 children. If his theology was shallow, if he was just about God wanting you to be happy and comfortable, it would have shattered the first time he buried the toddler.
Absolutely.
But because his theology was anchored in the absolute sovereignty and the unsearchable wisdom and grace of God, it held him. And it is out of this very crucible of loss and newfound spiritual assurance that his public life exploded. In 1643, shortly after his conversion, he published his first book, A Display of Arminianism.
And this plunges him right into the brutal public controversies of his day.
Yes. He was aggressively arguing against the English High Church and the Dutch Remonstrants.
Let's clarify the Dutch Remonstrants. Who are they and why is Owen fighting them in print?
So the Remonstrants were the followers of Jacobus Arminius in the Netherlands. Decades earlier, they had published a remonstrance, which was a document protesting against the classic Calvinist doctrines of predestination. They argued that man has the power to resist God's grace, and that election is conditional. Owen's first book was a vigorous defense of the sovereign, irresistible grace of God. And the reason he fought so hard for it was because that sovereign grace had become utterly, personally precious to him after his conversion.
He knew what was at stake.
He knew that if salvation depended even a little bit on his own free will or his own goodness, he was doomed.
So you have this incredibly potent mix, a razor-sharp, Oxford-trained intellect, a heart broken by deep personal sorrow, and a soul newly set on fire with spiritual assurance. And this combination catapults him onto the national stage at the exact moment the nation is tearing itself apart. The English Civil War between Parliament and King Charles I is raging.
It's a time of unprecedented political and social upheaval. The established order is crumbling. And Owen, because of the sheer brilliance of his writing and his preaching, finds himself right in the crosshairs of Oliver Cromwell.
This begins a period of his life where he is essentially drafted into the highest levels of national leadership. In 1646, he's invited to preach to Parliament. That was a massive, highly visible honor. And it caught the attention of Oliver Cromwell, who was the military and governmental leader eventually taking the title of Lord Protector during the period when the monarchy was abolished.
The historical interaction between the two of them is so cinematic. Cromwell meets Owen and supposedly says to him, "Sir, you are a person I must be acquainted with."
And Owen, not missing a beat, replies, "That will be much more to my advantage than yours."
It's a very humble, yet incredibly politically astute response. And Cromwell immediately pulls him into the fray. He doesn't just want him as an advisor, he makes Owen his personal chaplain.
Wow.
He takes Owen with him on military campaigns to Ireland and Scotland. Owen's job was to preach to the troops, to assess the religious and political landscapes in these conquered territories, and essentially to provide the theological scaffolding for Cromwell's political movements.
And we should pause here to provide some context for the listener. The English Civil War was incredibly messy. Both left and right, royalist and parliamentarian, had their complex, often bloody justifications for what they were doing.
Oh, definitely.
We're looking at this historically, not endorsing the 17th-century union of church and state or the violence of the era. We're simply reporting the historical reality. John Owen was suddenly thrust into the very center of governmental power. And Cromwell didn't stop at making him a chaplain. In 1651, Cromwell appoints Owen as the dean of Christ Church College in Oxford. And the very next year, he promotes him to be the vice-chancellor of the entire University of Oxford.
Which is an unimaginably demanding role, especially in the 17th century. Oxford was not just a school. Christ Church was a massive cathedral and an institution of state. The administrative load placed on Owen was staggering.
What kind of things was he managing?
He was responsible for the services of worship. He had to oversee the choice of students, appoint chaplains, provide tutorial facilities, administer strict discipline in a very unruly time, oversee vast properties, collect rents and tithes, grant livings to ministers, and even care for the almsmen, the poor, in the church hospital.
So imagine you are the listener right now. I want you to picture being the CEO of a major Ivy League university today. Now add to that being the personal, spiritual confidant to the head of state of your country during a civil war. Then add the reality of being a father who is actively grieving the deaths of his children.
It's just too much.
We know historically that he lost at least 2 sons to the plague in 1655, right in the middle of this period. And still, during these exact years at Oxford, he wrote and published 22 major works.
And we must emphasize, these weren't short blog posts or small pamphlets. These were massive, defining works of theology. During this period, he wrote of the mortification of sin in believers in 1656, of communion with God in 1657, and of temptation in 1658.
Just the mortification of sin alone is considered a masterpiece of Christian psychology. It's where we get his famous quote, "Be killing sin or it will be killing you." He breaks down exactly how the human heart deceives itself.
He also wrote a 666-page defense of the perseverance of the saints.
Okay, 666 pages is a brick. Why did he need to write 666 pages on this specific topic? Who was he fighting?
He was writing against a man named John Goodwin. Goodwin had published a book arguing that a true born-again believer could ultimately fall away and lose their salvation. To Owen, this was a direct attack on the very nature of the New Covenant and the promises of God.
So how does Owen dismantle that mechanically?
Owen argues that if salvation depends on our ability to hold on to God, we will all fall away. But the doctrine of perseverance of the saints, the P in tulip, teaches that it's actually God who holds on to the believer.
Ah, I see.
Owen points out that Christ's intercession for his people is continuous and unfailing. He argues that the Holy Spirit permanently indwells the believer, and that God's covenant promises are not conditional on our flawless performance, but on Christ's flawless performance imputed to us. He took 666 pages to meticulously prove from every angle of Scripture that God will never let one of his true children be lost.
And he wrote this 666-page brick by candlelight with a quill pen while running a university and mourning his dead sons. How did his physical body not completely give out?
The truth is, it almost did. He pushed himself to the absolute physical breaking point. We have his farewell address from when he finally finished his duties as vice-chancellor, and it's brutally honest.
What does he say?
He talked about his numberless labors, the intense opposition he faced, and being brought repeatedly to the brink of death. He actually stated that he hated his feeble body because it was constantly ready to desert the ambitions of his mind.
Wow. It's a profound, almost tragic illustration of what J.I. Packer called the Puritan ideal. Packer famously called Puritanism a reformed monasticism outside the cloister.
That is a brilliant phrase. Historically, if you wanted to be truly holy, the Catholic model was the cloister. You became a monk, you withdrew from society, you went to a monastery where it was quiet, and you prayed all day.
But Owen proves you do not need a quiet, secluded, perfectly balanced life to be holy or deeply fruitful. His goal wasn't to escape the world to find God. His aim was to take the chaos of the world, the entire academic curriculum of Oxford, and submerge it in preaching, catechizing, and prayer.
Yeah.
He wanted students to be proficient in the arts and sciences, but more importantly, he wanted them to aspire after godliness right in the middle of a messy, violent world. He was the ultimate doer.
But as is always the case in history, political winds eventually shift, and they shifted drastically for Owen. Oliver Cromwell died in 1658, and shortly after, the entire political structure Cromwell built collapsed. The monarchy was restored, and King Charles II came back to the throne in 1660.
So the pendulum swings back.
Suddenly, the Puritans, who had been in charge, are entirely on the wrong side of the establishment.
The empire strikes back. In 1662, Parliament passes the Act of Uniformity. Let's explain the mechanics of this act because it changes Owen's life forever.
The Act of Uniformity essentially required every minister in the Church of England to swear absolute, unfeigned assent and consent to everything in the newly revised Book of Common Prayer. They had to conduct worship exactly according to the state's liturgical prescriptions.
And for a Puritan conscience, which believed that worship should be dictated only by Scripture and not by human invention or state mandate, this was an impossible line to cross.
Exactly. They could not in good conscience swear to it. As a direct result, on St. Bartholomew's Day in 1662, roughly 2,000 Puritan pastors were forcibly ejected from their pulpits. They lost their incomes, their homes, and their legal right to preach. It is known as the Great Ejection.
And John Owen goes from running the most prestigious university in the country, having the ear of the head of state, to running from the law.
It's a wild turnaround.
He becomes a fugitive pastor in London for the last 23 years of his life. He is stripped of all his academic power, his national platform is gone, and he's constantly dodging state persecution. If he's caught preaching to a gathering of more than 5 people outside his immediate family, he could be imprisoned or fined into poverty.
Yet, it's during this fugitive time that his character shines the brightest. He becomes the leading champion for Congregationalism.
What is the core difference between Congregationalism and the Episcopalian system he was fighting?
Episcopalianism is a top-down hierarchy. The king appoints the bishops appoint the priests, and the state dictates the worship. Congregationalism argues that the local congregation of believers has the authority under Christ to govern itself, choose its own pastors, and manage its own affairs without state interference.
Okay, that makes sense.
Owen became the theological architect defending this model. But even more crucially, he became a massive advocate for tolerance.
Which is incredibly rare for the 17th century. People back then did not do tolerance well. But when Owen was at Oxford, when he had all the power and the backing of Cromwell, he actually allowed Episcopalians, who were technically his political and theological enemies, to meet and worship in rooms right across from his own quarters.
He really did.
He didn't use the sword of the state to crush them when he easily could have.
He had a profound understanding that you cannot coerce the conscience. To have faith must be voluntary. And later in his life, his writings on tolerance deeply influenced people like William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, who established his colony on principles of religious liberty.
That's a huge legacy.
Owen even wrote a letter to the Puritan leaders in Massachusetts, begging them not to persecute the Baptists who were dissenting from them.
He understood that having the ear of kings and lords meant you should use your political capital to fight for the marginalized, not just consolidate your own power. He wasn't threatened by those who practiced differently as long as they were within the bounds of Christian orthodoxy. And his pastoral heart during this fugitive period in London is just incredible to read about.
Because he couldn't always be physically present with his flock, it was simply too dangerous for a high-profile figure like him to be seen consistently in one place. He wrote them pastoral letters.
There's this one specific piece of advice he gives his church that is so applicable even today. He tells them that because the teachers and pastors can't walk about safely to visit everyone, the congregation itself needs to step up. He tells them to appoint members to go up and down, from house to house, specifically to encourage the weak, the tempted, and the fearful during the intense persecution.
It's a beautifully decentralized model of pastoral care born out of strict necessity. He was telling the everyday believers, you don't need a seminary degree to care for each other. You are equipped for this blessed work. Go check on the fearful.
Yeah.
It shows that his massive, towering theology was intensely, warmly practical. He cared about the trembling believer hiding in their home just as much as he cared about high-level debates on justification.
And that practical humility perfectly transitions us into one of the most fascinating, unlikely relationships in his entire life. The deep friendship between John Owen, the former vice-chancellor of Oxford, the prodigy who read Greek and Latin for fun, and John Bunyan.
John Bunyan, the completely uneducated tinker. A tinker was someone who traveled around mending metal pots and pans. He was a working-class layman who eventually became a preacher and would go on to write The Pilgrim's Progress.
They seem like they're from two completely different planets. King Charles II actually asked Owen one time, why in the world a man of his immense learning and academic pedigree would bother going to hear an uneducated tinker preach?
And Owen's reply is legendary. He looked at the king and said, could I possess the tinker's abilities for preaching? Please, your majesty, I would gladly relinquish all my learning.
That is staggering humility.
It really is.
Yeah.
It demonstrates that Owen valued the unction and the power of the Holy Spirit over any academic pedigree. He recognized that Bunyan, despite having no formal theological training, had a profound, deeply experiential grip on the gospel that simply cannot be learned in a classroom.
Yeah.
Bunyan knew the human heart, and he knew the grace of Christ intimately.
But their relationship goes so much deeper than just mutual respect from afar. Because Bunyan was an unauthorized preacher, he spent many, many years in the Bedford County Jail. He was separated from his wife and his blind daughter, making shoelaces in a cell to survive.
Yeah.
And Owen, who despite being a fugitive still had some connections in high places, tried repeatedly to pull strings to get Bunyan out.
He advocated for him, he leveraged his remaining influence, but he failed. Over and over, Owen's attempts to free his friend completely failed. Bunyan stayed in prison.
And this is where we see what the hymn writer William Cowper calls a frowning providence. Because Owen failed to get Bunyan out of jail, Bunyan had nothing but time. Time to think, time to pray, and time to write. And when he finally came out of prison in 1676, he brought with him the manuscript for the Pilgrim's Progress.
A book that has arguably done more good after the Bible itself than almost any other piece of literature in Christian history. And even then, Owen's failure to free him turned into a massive success on another front.
How so?
When Bunyan needed to get this manuscript printed, Owen connected him with his own trusted publisher, Nathaniel Ponder. That partnership is what brought the Pilgrim's Progress to the masses.
It's the ultimate irony. Think about it. If Owen's plans had succeeded, if he had pulled the right string and gotten Bunyan out of jail early, Bunyan might have just gone back to being a busy, localized pastor, and the world might never have received the Pilgrim's Progress.
It's wild to think about.
So, for you listening to this, what does this mean when your own plans completely fail? When you are pulling all the strings for a genuinely good, noble cause, like trying to free an innocent man from prison, and heaven just seems to say a flat no.
It's a profound lesson in trusting God's overarching sovereignty over our good intentions. We see the immediate obstacle. God sees the long-term masterpiece. Owen and Bunyan both shared this deep, unshakable trust that God was working all things for good, even unjust imprisonment.
And they remained linked in history. In fact, when Owen died on August 24, 1683, he was buried in Bunhill Fields in London, which was the nonconformist burial ground. And just 5 years later, John Bunyan died and was buried right there with him. The academic giant and the uneducated tinker lying down together in the same dirt.
The beautiful image of the unity of the faith.
So up to this point, we've explored the what of John Owen's life. We've seen the incredible tragedy, the chaotic politics, the staggering productivity. But the real depth of the historical analysis we are looking at focuses on how Owen sustained this.
We need to look at the inner mechanics.
Right, of a man who relentlessly pursued holiness in the face of so much suffering and pressure. The analysis breaks down the anatomy of Owen's holiness, and it all centers on his stated life aim, which he articulated when he was 40 years old. He said his goal was mortification and universal holiness.
Let's define those terms clearly. Mortification means putting to death the deeds of the flesh. It's the active, daily, ruthless killing of sin in your own heart. And universal holiness means pursuing a life that honors God in every single sphere, public, private, academic, didactic. Yes, everything. He wanted to kill sin and promote holiness in himself and in others, so that the gospel will be beautifully adorned, not just theorized about.
The historical synthesis identifies 4 specific pillars in Owen's pursuit of holiness. And the first pillar is humility. Now, considering he was one of the most intellectually gifted and politically influential men of his day, arrogance would have been the natural default.
But he viewed himself with incredible sobriety. Just 2 days before he died, he wrote a letter to his friend Charles Fleetwood, and in it he calls himself a poor under-rower.
A poor under-rower. This is the guy who basically ran Oxford University and advised the Lord Protector.
Yes. He wrote that he was leaving the ship of the church while it was still in a massive storm of persecution. But he found comfort because, as he said, the great pilot was steering the ship, and therefore the loss of one single under-rower like himself was completely inconsiderable.
He genuinely didn't view himself as the captain. He kept himself low by constantly contemplating his own inbred sinfulness. And he also deeply acknowledged the unsearchable mysteries of God. For all his 666-page books, he knew enough to know exactly how little he actually knew. He once wrote that the depths of the mystery of godliness are unsearchable to the most enlightened minds in this life. We only ever see the fringes of God's ways.
Which leads directly into the second pillar of his holiness, which is obedience. Owen deeply believed that you only truly learn by practicing. He warned that the true notion of holy truths will not flourish in a mind where they are divided from a holy life.
Let's drill into the mechanics of that. Why does theology fail if you aren't being obedient?
Because spiritual truth is not like mathematical truth. You can understand that 2 + 2 = 4, regardless of your moral character. But spiritual truth is designed to transform the affections. If you learn about God's grace, but you act ruthlessly toward your neighbor, your disobedience essentially short-circuits your ability to understand the depth of that grace.
So the action is tied to the understanding.
Owen said that if you aren't living it, you don't really understand it.
He used a very striking phrase. He said, "Without this, the mind will be quickly stuffed with notions so that no streams can descend into it from the fountain of truth." Think about that phrase. Stuffed with notions. Imagine an artery that is completely clogged with cholesterol.
Oh, that's vivid.
In our modern age, where we consume endless content, articles, deep dives, and books, we suffer from massive info overload. Are we just stuffing our minds with notions? If there's no practical obedience in our daily lives, it's like our spiritual arteries get blocked and the living stream of truth can't flow. The more we consume without obeying, the more damage we actually do to ourselves.
That is exactly the dynamic he was warning against. It's the difference between knowledge that merely inflates the ego and knowledge that genuinely transforms the soul. Owen made personal daily obedience the direct effect of all he learned, which then became the foundational means of learning even more. It was a virtuous cycle.
And the engine driving that obedience was the third pillar, communion with God. J.I. Packer points out that for the Puritans, communion with God was the absolute center of everything. Today, Christians talk endlessly about church strategy, politics, methods, and cultural engagement, but rarely about their actual daily felt experience of God.
Owen was incredibly intentional about this. He didn't leave communion to chance. He called it maintaining friendship with God through visits.
I love that concept, taking the time to just visit Jesus the way you would visit a close friend. How did that practically work out in his massive scholarly projects?
Toward the end of his life, he wrote a massive 7-volume commentary on the book of Hebrews. It's an absolute masterpiece of biblical exegesis, and he openly stated that he accomplished it through assiduous meditation and prayer. That was his primary resort. When the text got tangled or the historical context was confusing, he didn't just lean on his intellect. He prayed and meditated on the passage until the spiritual light broke through. His academic work was fundamentally an act of worship.
Which brings us to the fourth and perhaps most piercing pillar of his life: authenticity. Owen absolutely refused to publish or preach any doctrine that he hadn't first deeply experienced in his own soul. He issued a severe warning against what he called the terrible disease of unauthenticity in ministry and learning.
And this disease is so subtle, it creeps up on anyone who handles truth regularly.
It hit me hard reading about this. He said, "It is so terribly easy to speak of mysteries without standing in awe of them. It is easy to speak of purity without feeling pure, to speak of heaven without actually having any eagerness to go there."
Yeah.
Over time, for pastors, for teachers, for writers, the words just come easy. The vocabulary is there, but a terrible, silent hardening of the spiritual life sets in behind the scenes.
It's the professionalization of holy things. Owen fought that hardening with everything he had. He echoed the Apostle Paul, saying, "I have believed and therefore I have spoken." He essentially insisted on testing the spiritual food on himself before he ever served it to others.
He wrote that a man who doesn't feed on and digest the spiritual food he provides for others won't make it savory for them. In fact, he might accidentally be feeding them poison. It's like a chef who cooks these lavish Michelin-star meals for a dining room full of people, but starves themselves in the back kitchen. Or worse, a chef who serves a meal they wouldn't dare eat themselves.
Owen refused to be that hypocrite. He made sure he was personally nourished and humbled by the exact doctrines he was publicly defending. A beautiful example of this is his exposition of Psalm 130. It's famously described as Owen laying open his own wounded heart right alongside the ancient text.
That's beautiful.
He wasn't just analyzing Hebrew syntax. He was bleeding his own desperate need for forgiveness and his own spiritual experience of God's redemption right onto the page.
And he claimed that this authenticity was his ultimate defense mechanism. He said that when we have real, living communion with God in the very doctrine we contend for, then we will be garrisoned by the grace of God against the assaults of men.
That word garrisoned is vital. A garrison is a fortified stronghold. His communion with Christ was his armor.
Right.
He wasn't just intellectually committed to Calvinism or Congregationalism. He was experientially garrisoned by grace. It was the only way he survived the vicious character assassinations from his political enemies. It's also how he survived the painful misunderstandings and wounds from his friends, like the famous missionary John Eliot, who sharply criticized Owen at one point based on false information.
But he didn't snap back.
No, Owen didn't retaliate with venom. He responded with grace because his identity was secured in Christ, not in public opinion.
And that deep garrison communion was his final comfort at the very end of his life. As we wrap up this journey through his life, we have to look at his final days in August 1683. He was suffering greatly from gallstones and asthma, confined to his bed. He was in the process of finishing his last book, appropriately titled Meditations on the Glory of Christ.
Very fitting.
His good friend William Payne was helping him edit the manuscript and get it to the publisher. As the very end drew near, Payne came to him and told him the book was finally in the press. Owen looked at him and said, "I am glad to hear it, but, oh, Brother Payne, the long-wished-for day is come at last, in which I shall see that glory in another manner than I have ever done or was capable of doing in this world."
It's the perfect conclusion to his life. He had spent his entire existence gazing at the glory of Christ through the Scriptures, writing millions of words to describe it, but always seeing it through a glass darkly. And now he was finally stepping out of the shadows to see it face to face.
So, to bring all this together for you, John Owen wasn't just a massive brain floating in a jar. His towering intellect, his legendary defense of Reformed theology, his 666-page treatises, it was all deeply, inextricably fused with devastating personal loss, extreme public and political pressure, and an unyielding daily commitment to walking with God.
His life proves that rigorous, airtight theology and deep, warm, experiential faith are not enemies. In fact, they desperately require each other. You cannot survive the kind of furnace Owen lived in without both a solid, unshakable grasp of God's sovereignty and a tender, humble walk with His Spirit. Theology without experience is dead orthodoxy, and experience without theology is vulnerable fanaticism. Owen embodied the perfect marriage of the two.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over today. We so often fall into the trap of thinking that we need perfect conditions to grow intellectually and spiritually. We think we need that quiet room, that stress-free schedule, a comfortable bank account, and a life completely devoid of tragedy before we can do anything meaningful for God.
We really do.
But John Owen achieved his most profound insights, wrote his greatest works, and displayed his deepest holiness while his world was literally burning down around him with the plague, with a violent civil war, and with the unimaginable repeated grief of burying his own children. What if the very chaos, the very pressures, and the very tragedies in your life right now are not the obstacles preventing your growth? What if they are the exact furnace required to forge it? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive on Reformed thinking. Keep exploring, keep thinking, and we will see you next time.